On October 6, 1973, Israel was at its quietest. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when much of the country shut down, roads emptied, and many soldiers were away from their posts or observing the holiday. That same day was also the 10th day of Ramadan, giving the conflict one of its other names, the Ramadan War. Across two tense frontiers, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack. In the south, Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula. In the north, Syrian forces surged into the Golan Heights. What began as a sudden military blow became a turning point in Middle Eastern history, shaking Israeli confidence, restoring Arab morale after earlier defeat, and pulling the Cold War superpowers into a dangerous confrontation through their support for opposite sides. To understand why the war happened, we have to go back to 1967. In the Six-Day War, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria, along with other territories. For Israel, those lands became strategic buffers. The Sinai created distance between Egypt and Israel's core population centers, while the Golan Heights overlooked northern Israel and offered commanding military positions. For Egypt and Syria, however, the loss was humiliating and politically intolerable. The defeat left deep wounds across the Arab world, where leaders and publics alike sought some way to reverse the outcome. By 1973, the front lines had hardened into ceasefire lines, but the underlying conflict had not been resolved. The war that erupted in October was not random. It was rooted in the unresolved aftermath of 1967. The attackers' strategy depended on surprise, timing, and limited but powerful objectives. Egypt and Syria did not need to destroy Israel outright to change the political reality. They needed to break the sense that Israel's military position was unchallengeable. Egypt focused on Operation Badr, a carefully planned crossing of the Suez Canal. The canal was more than a waterway, it was a defensive barrier, separating Egyptian forces from the Israeli-held Sinai. Syrian forces, meanwhile, struck across the ceasefire line in the Golan Heights, where the terrain was narrow, elevated, and strategically vital. By attacking at the same time, Egypt and Syria forced Israel to divide its attention and reserves. The opening move was designed to create shock, seize territory, and prove that the post-1967 borders were not permanent. In Sinai, Egypt's crossing of the Suez Canal was the war's first major success. Egyptian forces moved across the water, established bridgeheads, and dug into defensive positions on the eastern bank. This mattered because Egypt was not simply charging deep into the desert at the beginning. Its first goal was to secure a foothold under the protection of air defenses positioned on the Egyptian side. That approach reduced Israel's ability to use air power freely against the crossing forces. For Egypt, the symbolic value was enormous. The canal, lost as a military barrier after 1967, had been crossed. Egyptian soldiers were back on land Israel had controlled for 6 years. The psychological impact of this achievement was as important as the territorial gain itself. At the same time, the northern front became a desperate battle for the Golan Heights. Syrian forces advanced quickly and gained ground in territory Israel had occupied since 1967. The Golan was especially dangerous for Israel because of its geography. It was close to Israeli communities in the north, and its elevated terrain made it a powerful military platform. If Syrian forces broke through decisively, the consequences could be severe. Israel had to mobilize reserves rapidly and send them into battle under pressure. The early Syrian advance intensified the sense of national emergency. For Israel, this was not a distant war fought only in the desert. The fighting in the Golan felt immediate, close, and potentially existential. After the first shock, Israel began to recover. Within roughly 3 days, Israeli forces managed to halt the Egyptian advance in Sinai and push most Syrian forces back toward the earlier ceasefire line, known as the Purple Line. This did not mean the danger was over. It meant Israel had survived the opening phase and could begin to use its strengths, mobilized reserves, battlefield adaptation, and counterattack. On the Syrian front, Israel pushed beyond defense into offense, launching a counteroffensive into Syria and even shelling the outskirts of Damascus. This put pressure on Syria and changed the rhythm of the war. The initial Arab momentum was no longer unchallenged. The conflict had entered a new phase, one in which both sides were trying to convert battlefield movement into political leverage. As Syria came under heavier pressure, Egypt faced a strategic choice. Egyptian forces had already achieved their first major goal by crossing the canal and holding positions in Sinai. But with the Syrian front in danger, Egypt renewed its advance on October 14, hoping to relieve pressure on its ally. This move proved costly. Egyptian units pushed farther into Sinai, where they were more exposed and less protected by the defensive umbrella that had helped them earlier. Israeli forces exploited the failed advance. The battle opened an opportunity for Israel to strike at the seam between Egyptian armies and eventually breach the Suez Canal area. A war that had begun with Egypt crossing east into Sinai now saw Israeli forces preparing to cross in the opposite direction, westward toward mainland Egypt. Israel's crossing near the Suez Canal became one of the decisive developments of the war. Israeli forces moved through a gap and advanced on the western side of the canal, pushing north toward Ismailia and south toward Suez. Their goal was not only to gain territory but to threaten the supply lines of Egypt's Second and Third Armies. If those armies were cut off, Egypt's military position could become extremely vulnerable. But this was not a clean or easy breakthrough. Israeli troops met fierce resistance on multiple fronts, and urban and canal-side fighting became intense. The battlefield was fluid, dangerous, and politically explosive. By threatening the Egyptian Third Army's supply lines, Israel gained leverage, but it also increased the urgency for international intervention before the conflict escalated further. The Yom Kippur War was also a Cold War crisis. The United States backed Israel, while the Soviet Union supported the Arab states. As the fighting intensified, both superpowers launched major resupply efforts to keep their allies in the war. Weapons, ammunition, and equipment became part of a wider geopolitical struggle. The Middle East was not just a regional battlefield, it was a place where American and Soviet influence collided. The resupply operations heightened tensions and raised the stakes far beyond Sinai and the Golan Heights. Neither superpower wanted its ally to suffer a devastating defeat, but neither wanted a direct US-Soviet confrontation either. This made diplomacy urgent. The war showed how quickly a regional conflict could become entangled with the global power balance of the 1970s. On October 22, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. In theory, it should have stopped the fighting. In practice, it collapsed almost immediately, with each side accusing the other of violations. The renewed fighting allowed Israel to continue its advance in the south and strengthen the threat to Egypt's Third Army. However, Israel did not capture the city of Suez, and resistance remained fierce. The final days of the war were marked by uncertainty, battlefield gains, diplomatic pressure, and the danger that the situation could spiral. A second ceasefire took effect on October 25, officially ending the conflict. The war had lasted less than 3 weeks, from October 6 to October 25, but in that short time it transformed the strategic assumptions of every major actor involved. The outcome of the war was complex because both sides could claim something, and both sides had. Reasons for alarm. Israel recovered from the surprise attack, pushed Syrian forces back, crossed the Suez Canal, and threatened Egyptian supply lines. In strictly military terms, those were major achievements. Yet the early shock exposed weaknesses in Israeli intelligence, preparedness, and assumptions about deterrence. The belief that Israel's military dominance would prevent major attack had been badly shaken. For Egypt and the wider Arab world, the war provided psychological vindication after the humiliation of 1967. Egyptian forces had crossed the canal, held ground, and forced the world to re-engage with the unresolved territorial dispute. Even without a sweeping victory, the Arab coalition had changed the political atmosphere. The war's long-term consequences were even more important than its battlefield movements. It helped open the path to diplomacy between Egypt and Israel. The sense of restored Egyptian pride made negotiation more politically possible, while Israel's recognition of future uncertainty made a purely military status quo less convincing. These shifts contributed to the peace process that led to the 1978 Camp David Accords. Israel eventually returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty became the first time an Arab country formally recognized Israel. Egypt also drifted away from the Soviet Union and eventually left the Eastern Bloc orbit. The Yom Kippur War did not solve the broader Arab-Israeli conflict, but it reshaped it. A surprise attack meant to break a deadlock became the beginning of a new diplomatic era. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.